"Sir, you don't belong in first class." The words weren't loud, but they carried just enough for everyone nearby to hear, just enough for the quiet judgment to ripple through the gate like a low hum under fluorescent lights. And Ethan Brooks didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look offended. He simply stood there in his worn denim jacket with his 6-year-old daughter Lily holding his hand, her small fingers tightening as if she already understood what adults rarely say out loud, that some people are measured before they're ever known. And behind the counter the agent tapped her screen again with a polite smile that had no warmth. "You can take your assigned seat in coach, sir," she added, as if correcting a mistake that never should have happened, and a few passengers nearby exchanged glances, a couple of them smirking quietly, one man whispering something that made another chuckle under his breath, and Ethan just nodded once, calm, steady, like a man who had long ago learned that dignity doesn't need permission. But then something shifted just a few feet away, where a pregnant woman stood near the window, one hand resting gently on her stomach, her posture strong, but her face pale, the kind of pale that comes from exhaustion, not weakness. And no one moved toward her, no one offered a seat. No one noticed the way her breathing had grown just slightly uneven, and Ethan saw it, not dramatically, not like a hero in a movie, but the way good people notice things quietly, and he looked down at Lily, who looked back up at him with wide eyes, and he gave her a small nod, the kind that didn't need words, and then he turned, stepped forward, and walked toward the woman while the murmurs behind him lingered. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice low, steady, "you should take my seat." And for a second she just stared at him, confused, almost caught off guard by something so simple. "I'm fine," she replied softly, but her hand tightened slightly against her side, and Ethan didn't push, didn't insist. He just held out the boarding pass. "It's first class," he said, like it didn't matter, like it wasn't something he had saved for months to afford, like it wasn't the one small gift he had planned for his daughter on this trip. And Lily looked up at him again, her voice barely above a whisper, "Dad, are you sure?" And he smiled, not big, not dramatic, just enough. "She needs it more," he said. And that was it. No speech, no explanation, just quiet grace. And behind them someone scoffed lightly. Another person raised a phone, capturing the moment like it was entertainment, but Ethan didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge any of it. Because for him, this wasn't about proving anything. It was about something far simpler. Something most people in that room had forgotten. And as the woman slowly reached out and took the ticket, her eyes lingering on his face just a moment longer than expected, there was a question there, unspoken, something deeper than gratitude. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the glass and steel and noise, something unseen had already begun to shift, quietly, patiently. Like the calm before silence, no one in that terminal was ready for the woman did not move right away. Not because she did not understand the gesture, but because she was trying to understand him, her fingers resting on the edge of the boarding pass as if it carried more weight than paper should. And when she finally took it, her voice was softer now, stripped of the guarded tone she had before. "Why would you do that? For someone you do not even know?" she asked, her eyes searching his face not for an answer, but for something deeper, something that could not be explained easily. And Ethan shrugged lightly. The kind of shrug that came from a man who had stopped keeping score a long time ago. "Because someone should," he said, simple, quiet, final. And that answer did not impress her, it did not surprise her, but stayed with her like a note that lingered longer than expected. And behind them the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, voices overlapping, shoes scuffing across polished floors. The ordinary rhythm of travel continuing as if nothing meaningful had just happened. But something had, and she felt it, even if no one else did. And as she turned to walk toward the gate, escorted now with a sudden shift in attention from the same staff who had ignored her moments ago, she glanced back once, just once, and Ethan was already kneeling slightly to adjust his daughter's jacket, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, speaking to her in a low voice that no one else could hear. And the contrast was quiet but undeniable, power and gentleness existing in the same frame. Yet only one of them chose kindness without an audience. And inside the jet bridge the air grew cooler, the hum of the aircraft faint but constant, and the woman stepped forward into first class without hesitation this time. Not because she needed the comfort, but because she was thinking, calculating, remembering. And when the flight attendant greeted her with a suddenly sharpened posture and a voice that carried respect instead of routine politeness, she nodded once and took her seat, her hand resting again on her stomach as she exhaled slowly. But her eyes did not settle. They moved, thoughtful, distant, as if replaying something over and over again. And back in the main cabin, Ethan guided Lily into their narrow row, helping her climb into the window seat, her small face pressing lightly against the glass as she watched ground crew move below like a quiet dance of machinery in motion. "It is still going to be fun, right?" she asked, her voice hopeful but careful, and Ethan smiled again, that same calm smile. "It always is when we are together," he said, and for a moment, that was enough, the world shrinking down to something simple, something real. But then the delay came, subtle at first, just a pause in the usual sequence. A flight attendant whispering to another, a glance exchanged, a message passed forward instead of backward. And the cabin did not notice immediately because most people were too busy with their own screens, their own conversations, their own assumptions, but the shift was there, quiet control like a breath being held. And in first class, the woman closed her eyes briefly, then reached for her phone, her fingers moving with purpose now, not hesitation, dialing a number she clearly knew by memory. And when the call connected, her voice changed, not louder, not sharper, just unmistakably different. "Hold the departure," she said, calm, precise, and somewhere beyond the walls of the aircraft, systems began to listen, because sometimes power does not announce itself. It simply speaks, and everything else adjusts in silence. The call did not raise her voice, but it changed everything. And within seconds, the quiet choreography of the aircraft began to shift in ways most passengers could not yet understand. A flight attendant paused mid-step, another glance toward the cockpit, and somewhere ahead a door opened that usually stayed closed until after takeoff. And still, no announcement came, no explanation, just a subtle delay stretching longer than it should, like a held breath that refused to release. And Ethan noticed it not because he was looking for something unusual, but because he had spent years learning how to read small changes in environments that other people ignored. The way noise drops half a level, the way movement slows just enough to matter. And Lily looked up at him, her voice curious. "Dad, why are we not moving?" And he leaned slightly toward her, keeping his tone light, steady. "Sometimes things just take a little longer," he said, though his eyes briefly scanned the aisle, catching the quiet urgency in the staff's movements. And a man across the row scoffed softly, checking his watch. "Unbelievable. Always something," he muttered, while another passenger behind them whispered about misconnections, frustration beginning to ripple outward in low waves. But Ethan did not join it, did not feed it, because he had learned something most people in that cabin had not, that impatience rarely fixes anything. And across the curtain in first class, the woman sat still, her posture composed, but her presence now unmistakably different, not louder, not demanding, just grounded in a kind of certainty that does not need to prove itself. And when the lead flight attendant approached her, the shift became clearer, shoulders squared, voice lowered. "Ma'am, the captain has been informed," she said quietly. And the woman nodded once, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were not reacting to the situation but guiding it. And then, after a pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should, the intercom clicked on, a soft static filling the cabin before the captain's voice followed, controlled, professional, but carrying an undertone that had not been there before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are currently addressing a brief operational matter. We will update you shortly." And that was all. No details, no timeline, just enough to confirm what everyone was beginning to feel, that something was different. And back in coach, the murmurs grew slightly louder, confusion mixing with annoyance. But Ethan remained still, his hand resting lightly over Lily's as she traced shapes on the window with her finger. And then, without warning, the curtain at the front of the cabin shifted, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention, and a uniformed pilot stepped out, not walking toward the exit, not heading down the aisle as expected, but stopping, scanning, as if looking for someone specific. and the energy in the cabin changed again, quieter this time, sharper, like the moment before a truth reveals itself. And in first class, the woman opened her eyes slowly, her gaze steady, knowing, and somewhere between the front of the plane and the narrow seat where Ethan sat with his daughter, a line had already been drawn, invisible to most, but impossible to ignore for those about to understand that the pilot did not raise his voice. But the moment he stepped forward, everything quieted just enough for people to notice, just enough for curiosity to replace irritation, and his eyes moved across the cabin with a purpose that did not belong to routine checks or casual observation. He was searching, not scanning, and when his gaze passed over Ethan for the first time, it did not stop, but it slowed, just slightly, like recognition trying to surface, and behind him the lead flight attendant followed, her posture sharper now, her smile gone, replaced with something more deliberate, more controlled, and a man 2 rows ahead leaned into the aisle, whispering, "What is going on?" while another shook his head, already annoyed, already assuming delay meant inconvenience. But Ethan stayed still, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other holding Lily's small fingers as she watched everything with wide, curious eyes, sensing the shift without understanding it. And then the pilot turned back toward first class, stepping behind the curtain for a brief moment. And when he reappeared, something had changed, not in his uniform, not in his tone, but in the weight of his presence, like a decision had been made. And the cabin felt it before it was spoken, that quiet tightening of attention that comes before something important is revealed, and the flight attendant moved ahead of him this time, walking directly down the aisle, past rows of passengers who instinctively pulled their legs in, conversations fading into silence as she passed, and she stopped beside Ethan, her voice low but unmistakably respectful. "Sir," she said, and for the first time since boarding, the word carried a different meaning, not assumption, not dismissal, but recognition, and Ethan looked up, calm as always, not surprised, not eager, just present. "Yes," he replied, and Lily glanced between them, her grip tightening slightly, and the attendant hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if adjusting not her words but her understanding. "We have been asked to escort you to the front of the aircraft," she said, carefully, and the man across the aisle let out a short laugh, thinking it was some kind of mistake. "Yeah, right," he muttered, but no one else laughed, not this time, because something in the air had shifted too far for mockery to survive, and Ethan did not stand immediately. He looked at Lily first, offering her that same quiet reassurance, that same steady presence. "Stay close," he said softly, and she nodded, trusting him without question. And as he rose, the narrow space of the cabin seemed to widen in a way no one could explain, as if attention itself had made room, and every step he took forward was met with a silence that grew heavier, deeper, until even the restless voices from earlier had disappeared completely, and behind the curtain, the woman stood now, no longer just another passenger, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the aisle, and when Ethan stepped into view, their eyes met again. But this time there was no confusion, no question, only clarity, and the pilot moved aside slightly, his voice firm but respectful. "Sir, she would like to speak with you." And in that moment, without announcement, without explanation, the truth began to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet authority that makes an entire room realize it has been wrong all along. The space in first class felt different, quieter but heavier, like every sound had been pulled back to make room for something more important. And Ethan stepped forward slowly with Lily close beside him, her small hand wrapped tightly around his, her eyes wide as she took in the polished seats, the soft lighting, the stillness that seemed to follow them in. And the woman stood just a few feet away now, no longer seated, no longer blending into the background, her presence unmistakable, steady, composed, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that did not ask for attention. It commanded understanding. "Ethan Brooks," she said, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and he paused slightly, not startled, just curious. "Yes," he replied, his tone unchanged, grounded, and Lily looked up at him, then at the woman, sensing that something important was happening even if she could not yet name it. And the woman took a slow breath, one hand resting gently over her stomach, as if anchoring herself before continuing. "My name is Clara Vance," she said, and the name alone did not ripple through the cabin yet. Not fully, but the pilot behind her straightened slightly. The flight attendant lowered her gaze just enough, and the silence deepened, and Clara's eyes did not leave Ethan's. "I own this airline," she added, not with pride, not with arrogance, but with simple truth, and that was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because behind the curtain, a few passengers leaned forward, catching the words, their expressions changing from curiosity to disbelief. And in the aisle just beyond, someone who had laughed earlier went still, the realization settling in like a weight they could not ignore, and Ethan did not react the way most would. He did not step back, did not apologize, did not suddenly change his posture. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging information, not status, and Clara noticed that. She noticed the absence of performance, the lack of awe, and something in her expression softened, not visibly, not enough for others to see, but enough for it to matter. "You gave up something valuable without knowing who I was," she said quietly. "You did not hesitate. You did not ask. You did not expect anything in return." And Ethan glanced briefly at Lily, then back at her. "She needed it," he said again, the same words, unchanged. Because for him, the reason had never been complicated, and Clara studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring not his actions, but the consistency of them, the quiet alignment between what he said and what he did. And behind her, the pilot shifted slightly, waiting, the flight attendant holding her breath without realizing it. And then Clara stepped aside, just enough to reveal the empty seat beside her. Wide, comfortable, untouched. "I would like you and your daughter to sit here," she said, her voice steady. But there was something more beneath it now, something personal, something that had moved beyond gratitude. And in the cabin behind them, the silence became complete, not forced, not requested, but chosen, because in that moment, everyone understood the same thing at once, that the man they had dismissed without a second thought was the only one who had acted with something real, something rare, something that could not be bought. And for the first time since boarding, no one whispered, no one laughed, no one judged. They simply watched quietly as dignity rewrote the room for a moment. Ethan did not move, not because he was unsure, but because he was listening to something deeper than the offer itself, the quiet weight behind Clara's words, the sincerity that could not be rehearsed. And Lily looked up at him again, her voice small but steady. "Dad, is it okay?" And he smiled gently, brushing her hair back the same way he always did. "It is just a seat," he said softly, but there was something else in his tone, something that reminded her that wherever they sat, they would be fine. And then he nodded once toward Clara, not in gratitude for the luxury, but in respect for the intention. "Thank you," he said, simple, direct. And that was enough. No long speech, no attempt to match her status. Just quiet dignity meeting quiet understanding. And Clara stepped aside fully now, allowing them to take the seats, her gaze following them not with ownership, but with a kind of careful attention, as if she was observing something rare that she did not want to disturb. And Lily climbed into the wide seat, her eyes lighting up for just a second before she caught herself, glancing at her father, as if asking permission to enjoy it. And Ethan nodded slightly, and that was all she needed. And behind them, the curtain remained slightly open, just enough for the rest of the cabin to see what was happening, and no one spoke. Not anymore, because something had shifted beyond explanation, something that made words feel unnecessary, and a man who had laughed earlier now stared at his hands, avoiding the scene entirely, while another passenger slowly lowered their phone, no longer interested in recording something they no longer understood, and the flight attendant moved quietly to adjust Lily's seatbelt, her movements careful, respectful, as if she were aware that this moment carried more than service. And the pilot stepped back toward the cockpit, but not before offering Ethan a brief nod, one that carried acknowledgement, not authority. And Clara remained standing for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on the seat in front of her, her posture still composed, but her eyes softer now, less guarded, and when she finally sat down across from Ethan, she did not speak immediately. She let the silence settle, let the moment breathe, because some things lose meaning when rushed, and outside the window, the ground crew continued their work, unaware that inside the aircraft, something far more significant had already taken place. And then Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice low, steady. "Most people give when they expect something back," she said, her eyes meeting his again. "You did not." And Ethan glanced briefly toward Lily, who was now looking out the window again, tracing shapes in the sky, before returning his gaze to Clara. "Some things are not meant to be traded," he replied, and that answer did not impress her. It did not surprise her, but it settled something inside her, something that had been searching for proof that goodness still existed without conditions. And for the first time since the delay began, Clara allowed herself a small breath, not of relief, but of recognition, because in a world where everything had a price, she had just met someone who lived outside of that system. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of respect, and for the rest of the cabin, it was the kind of silence that changes people, even if they do not admit it. The aircraft doors remained closed, but the energy inside had already taken off in a direction no one had expected. And as the engines began their low, steady hum, the kind that vibrates gently beneath your feet, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, this time clearer, more certain. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now ready for departure." And the announcement was routine, but nothing about the cabin felt routine anymore, because in first class, something rare had already settled into place, something that did not need altitude to rise. And Clara sat across from Ethan, her posture relaxed now, but her attention still fixed, not on his clothes, not on his situation, but on his consistency, the quiet alignment between his words and his actions. And she studied him the way people study something they do not fully understand yet, something valuable that cannot be measured easily. And Lily leaned closer to the window as the plane slowly pushed back from a gate, her breath fogging the glass slightly, her excitement returning in small, careful moments. And Ethan watched her for a second, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough, before turning back to Clara. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence between them was not empty. It was thoughtful, deliberate. And then Clara broke it, her voice softer than before, but more personal. "Do you always live like that?" she asked, not as a challenge, not as disbelief, but as genuine curiosity. And Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the question as if it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. "Like what?" he replied, and she held his gaze, "Giving without knowing what comes back," she said, and the plane began to roll slowly now, the runway lights stretching ahead like quiet markers of direction. And Ethan glanced out the window for just a second, then back at her. "I do not think about what comes back," he said, his tone calm, grounded. "I think about what is right in front of me." And that answer landed differently this time, not just as kindness, but as clarity. And Clara leaned back slightly, her hand resting again on her stomach, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, and she nodded once, as if something inside her had just aligned, something that had been out of place for a long time. And behind the curtain, the rest of the cabin remained unusually quiet, conversations muted, movements slower, because even those who did not hear every word could feel the shift, the kind of shift that does not come from announcements or authority, but from witnessing something real. And a man who had complained earlier now stared out his own window, thoughtful, unsettled, while another passenger adjusted their seat without a word, as if noise itself no longer belonged in that space. And the plane turned gently onto the runway, engines building with a steady, rising power. And Clara leaned forward slightly again, her eyes returning to Ethan. "I have met a lot of successful men," she said quietly. "Men with money, with control, with influence." And she paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing her next words carefully. And then she continued, her voice steady, honest, "But I have never met a man who made a decision like that without needing to be seen." And Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply met her gaze, Not with pride, not with modesty, just with presence. And as the engines roared stronger, pressing them gently back into their seats, something unspoken settled between them, something that did not need to be named yet, but was already understood. And as the plane lifted from the ground, leaving the noise of the terminal behind, the silence that followed inside the cabin was not empty. It was earned, and for the first time. It belonged to him at 30,000 feet. The noise of the world fell away, replaced by a steady, quiet hum that seemed to match the rhythm of something deeper, something calmer. And inside the cabin, the tension that once filled the space had dissolved into something else entirely. Something reflective, something almost humbling. And Clara sat with her hands folded loosely, her gaze no longer searching, but certain, as if she had already made a decision long before she spoke it aloud. And Lily leaned back in her seat now. Her earlier excitement softened into a peaceful curiosity, tracing the clouds outside as they stretched like endless fields beneath them. And Ethan remained the same, steady, grounded, unaffected by the shift in environment, as if first class or coach made no difference to the way he carried himself. And Clara noticed that not once had he looked around in awe, not once had he adjusted himself to fit the space. He simply existed within it, unchanged, and that was what stayed with her. Not the act itself, but the consistency behind it. And after a long moment of silence, she leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but clear. "I want to offer you something," she said, and Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, listening, not anticipating, not assuming, just present. And she continued, choosing her words carefully, not as a repayment, because what you did cannot be priced, but as a recognition of who you are. And the flight attendant nearby paused subtly, not interrupting, but aware that this was no longer a typical conversation, and Clara's eyes softened just enough to reveal something personal beneath the composure. "I built this company from nothing," she said. "I learned to trust numbers, contracts, outcomes, but somewhere along the way, I stopped trusting people." And she paused, her hand resting lightly over her stomach again, feeling the quiet life beneath it. "Until today," she added, and Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, as if weighing not her words, but their meaning. And Lily looked between them, sensing that this moment mattered even if she could not fully understand why. And Clara took a slow breath before continuing. "I want you to come work with me," she said, her voice steady, "not as an employee in the usual sense, but as someone I can trust, someone who sees what matters when no one is watching." And the words settled into the space like something fragile but powerful. And for a second, no one moved, not the attendant, not the passengers behind the curtain, not even the quiet hum of conversation returned, because the offer carried more than opportunity. It carried recognition. And Ethan did not react the way most would. He did not lean forward with excitement, did not ask about salary or position. He simply looked at Lily, his expression softening, grounding himself in what mattered most. And then he turned back to Clara, his voice calm, unchanged. "I have a life already," he said gently, not rejecting, not accepting, just stating truth. And Clara nodded slightly, as if she expected that, as if she respected it even more. And then she added, her tone softer now, more personal than before, "I am not asking you to leave it," she said. "I am asking you to bring it with you." And that was when the moment shifted again, not in power, but in possibility. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something rare, something that does not happen often. The moment when two different worlds do not collide, but begin to understand each other, quietly, without force, without demand, just with respect. The words did not rush him. They settled, slowly, like something meant to be understood rather than accepted. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting for just a moment toward the window where the clouds stretched endlessly beneath them, soft and distant, like a reminder of how small things could become when seen from the right height. And Lily shifted beside him, her head resting gently against his arm, her voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "Dad, is she nice?" And he smiled faintly, brushing her shoulder with a calm, steady hand. "She is learning," he said softly. And Clara heard that, not as judgment, but as truth, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Not the kind shaped by boardrooms or negotiations, but something simpler, something closer to who she used to be before the world taught her to measure everything. And she watched them for a moment, father and daughter, the quiet rhythm between them, the ease, the trust, the kind of connection that could not be built with power or money. And she understood something then, something that no balance sheet had ever shown her. That success without that kind of presence was incomplete, and she leaned forward again, her voice softer now, more human than before. "Then let me learn," she said, not as a command, not as an offer, but as a request, and Ethan met her gaze, steady as always, not impressed, not intimidated, just present. And for a moment he did not answer, because some decisions deserve silence before words. And the cabin remained still around them, the earlier noise of judgment, now replaced by something quieter, something reflective, and behind the curtain, passengers who had once dismissed him now avoided looking directly at him, not out of shame alone, but because they recognized something they could not easily explain. And Ethan finally nodded once, not as agreement to a job, not as acceptance of an offer, but as acknowledgement of something deeper. "We will see," he said, simple, open, and Clara understood that answer. She understood that trust was not given all at once. It was built quietly over time, just like the moment that had brought them here, and she leaned back in her seat, her hand resting again on her stomach, feeling the steady life beneath it. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something she could not negotiate or control, something that did not belong to contracts or strategies, something that felt like hope. And as the plane continued its path through the sky, steady and unwavering, the cabin remained wrapped in a silence that no one wanted to break, because it was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of reflection, full of the quiet realization that dignity does not announce itself. It reveals itself. And for those who had laughed, who had judged, who had measured a man before knowing him, there were no words left to say, because the truth had already done what it always does when given the chance. It made everything else fall silent.